In January 2026, the world saw shocking headlines about protests in Iran being met with an incredibly brutal crackdown. But today, we're going to look past the news cycle and see these events through a very different, very specific lens: international law. We're going to dive deep into one critical question: could these actions legally be considered crimes against humanity?
To really get a sense of what we're talking about, we have to start with this number: somewhere between 30 and 36,000 people. That's the estimated number of deaths in just 48 hours. Now, a number that staggering isn't just a tragedy. In the world of international law, it's a massive red flag. It's what sets off all the alarms and raises questions about the most serious crimes we can imagine.
So, how are we going to break all this down? Well, our guide for this whole explainer is a new, detailed legal report that has meticulously analyzed these events. You can think of it like a detective's brief, you know? It lays out the actions of the Iranian authorities and then weighs them against the strict definitions of international crimes. We're essentially going to walk through its key findings together. Okay, so let's start with Section 1, the human cost. The report really begins by setting the scene for us. In January 2026, protests spread across the nation, and they were met with a violent crackdown that led to that almost unthinkable death toll we just saw. Now, this quote here is, well, it's incredibly heavy. When a former prosecutor for the War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia mentions Srebrenica, that's not just for effect. Srebrenica is a legal benchmark for mass atrocity. This is a legal expert basically signaling that the scale and the nature of these killings have a terrifying historical precedent in one of the darkest moments in recent memory. So how does a terrible tragedy like this cross the line and potentially become an international crime? To get that, we have to understand the legal framework itself. So let's get into it. What exactly is a crime against humanity? All right, here's the core legal definition, and this comes directly from the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that created the International Criminal Court. The most important thing to get here is that this isn't about random individual acts. It's about those acts, like murder, being part of a much bigger picture. The key phrases the ones lawyers focus on are widespread or systematic, and that the attack is directed against any civilian population. So the report takes that definition and breaks it down. It basically argues that what happened in Iran ticks all the boxes. Was it widespread? Well, the violence happened in over 400 cities, so check. Was it systematic? The report points to things like the coordinated internet shutdown and the organized deployment of security forces. Check. Was the attack directed against a civilian population? Absolutely. These were protesters, not soldiers. Check. And finally, was it part of a state policy? The report alleges that the orders came from the very highest levels of government. Check. So now that we have that legal framework in our heads, let's look at how the report builds the specific case, connecting the actions we saw on the ground to these incredibly grave allegations. The legal analysis really zooms in on two particular crimes against humanity: extermination and murder. And I mean, when you're talking about a death toll in the tens of thousands, it's pretty clear why these two, which are all about the mass loss of life, are right at the center of the case. Okay, so this slide shows the two-part test that lawyers use for a crime like extermination. First, you have the guilty act. The Latin term is actus reus, and the report argues that killing tens of thousands of people pretty clearly meets that test. But you also need the guilty mind, or mens rea. This is all about intent. The report points to the deliberate use of things like snipers and heavy weapons against unarmed crowds as powerful evidence that the intent was to kill on a massive scale. And beyond the large-scale crime of extermination, the report also looks at individual acts of murder as a crime against humanity. It highlights two patterns that are just particularly chilling. First, reports of wounded protesters being basically hunted down and executed in hospitals, which is a huge violation of medical neutrality. And second, the widespread systematic use of snipers to pick off protesters in the streets. So if the evidence really does point towards these crimes, what happens now? And that brings us to the next, and maybe the most frustrating part of this story: the search for justice and the massive hurdles built into international law. There are really two main roads to justice, but they both have some serious roadblocks. First, you have the International Criminal Court, the ICC. But the big problem here: Iran never signed on to the treaty that created the court, so the ICC has no automatic jurisdiction. It's like trying to enforce the rules of a club on someone who isn't a member. The second path is called universal jurisdiction. Now, this is a fascinating legal idea that lets any country prosecute people for the absolute worst crimes, no matter where they happened. It's a powerful tool, but there's a huge catch. You usually have to have the accused person physically in your country to do it. Now, there is one other way to get a case to the ICC, a referral from the UN Security Council. But just look at how tough this is. The process requires a vote, and any one of the 5 permanent members, that's China, France, Russia, the UK, or the US, can kill the whole thing with a single no vote, a veto. It means that this path to justice is often more about global politics than it is about the law. With all of these legal and political roadblocks, it's really easy to feel like, well, what's the point? And that brings us to our final and maybe most important part of the story: the slow, patient, and absolutely critical work of laying the groundwork for a day in court that might be years or even decades away. So who's doing this work? A key player here is the UN's independent fact-finding mission on Iran. Now, this group doesn't have the power to prosecute anybody. Their job is something different, but you could argue it's just as important for the long-term pursuit of justice. You can think of what the mission does in 3 parts. First, they are evidence collectors. They gather videos, testimonies, documents, and make sure it's all preserved to the strict standards a court would require. Second, they're detectives, working to identify who the perpetrators were and mapping out the whole chain of command. And finally, all this work creates a ready-made case file, this perfect archive of evidence, just waiting for a moment when a legal pathway, like universal jurisdiction, might actually open up. And that really leaves us with the big, lingering question. We know the evidence of potential crimes against humanity is being meticulously collected, preserved, and analyzed. We know the legal frameworks to prosecute these crimes exist, even if they're flawed. But the question that remains is whether the political will can ever line up with the legal case to bridge that gap between evidence and accountability, and actually bring these horrific events before a court of law.